Hello and welcome to Data Salon episode number 5. I'm seeing lots of familiar faces. We're really glad you could join us. We see people still trickling in. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days. As you know, this is meant to be a lively conversation, and we do have truly an international audience as well as a set of expertise today as we consider Indigenous perspectives, both on how to address data appropriately and how we can think about collective perspectives when it comes to data. With that, first, I'd like to turn to our co-host with Accenture. We have Rob Hoffman. We're very appreciative of Accenture's support for everything we do with the Atlantic Council and the GeoTech Center. Rob, if you real quick to make some quick remarks, again, glad to have you as a partner.
Great, thank you very much, David, and really am looking forward to the panel this afternoon or evening, depending upon where you're at. I do want to thank David and the team at Atlantic Council and the GeoTech Center in particular. We're very excited to be one of the sponsors, not just of the center, but also the Data Salon Series. Permit me to run a brief statement through before we get going with the program. We are dedicated to inclusion and diversity and ensuring that everyone we work with feels that they belong. We do not tolerate racism, misogyny, misinformation, exclusion, or any other form of hate, and we refuse to let our work be a platform for those views. We have these views because it makes us and our work better and because it's the right thing to do. We have a great community of peers here who we respect and trust, and we look to all of you to hold us accountable, share advice, whether we solicit it or not. We want to do and be the best we can. So in that spirit, if any of you wishes to share your thoughts, feelings, or opinions, please feel encouraged to reach out. If you've got topics, themes, or speakers you'd like to see highlighted down the road, especially ones that could improve our inclusion and diversity efforts, do please let us know. With that, I'll turn it back over to David. And again, my thanks to this great panel and looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. And to amplify what Rob said, this is your data salon. Make it what you want it to be. Start typing your thoughts and questions in the chat. We definitely will circle to you. And I'd like to turn first to, well, one, I would say, again, of our panelists, we happen to have 4 PhDs amongst us, or 3, and then I guess myself, but 3 PhDs, which are quite impressive. First, we'd like to turn to Tao real quick. Could you introduce yourself, where you come from, what you're working on, and maybe something that you want the audience to think about? That would be great.
Sure, thank you, David. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nunui ki a koutou kua huhi mai te ata nei hei tautoko te kaupapa o te rāraunga. So greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, in my own native tongue, which I'm still learning. And I just wanted to say hello, my name is Tahu Kukutai. I'm a professor of demography at the National Institute of Demographic and Economic Analysis at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. One of the things that I've been working on for a couple of years now is in the space of Indigenous data sovereignty, really thinking about what are the ways that we can use data innovation to realize our self-determining aspirations as Indigenous peoples, while also mitigating some of the harms and worst excesses of data colonialism, because as Indigenous peoples, we know colonialism really well. One of the 2 things that I'm involved in at the moment, which are relevant to this theme that we're talking about today. One is working on a co-designed Indigenous data governance approach for all government-held data here in New Zealand. We're part of the D9 network, so we are a very digitally advanced economy. And one of the things we're looking at is how can we bring an Indigenous ethical approach to our data resources and approach across government. The second thing I'm involved in is a 4-year research program that's funded by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And again, we're looking at how can Indigenous concepts and practices inform an approach to data here which mitigates harms but also generates more equitable benefits for people who are currently sort of shut out of that. So I think one of the challenges is that Indigenous peoples in nearly every country in the world are amongst the most marginalised and dispossessed peoples in their homelands. but also have a distinctive set of collective rights to self-determination through their own treaties, but also through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Those rights have yet to be fully realised in any space, let alone the data space. So there's a challenge there. I guess in terms of the question for the participants, from your own context, that I think would be really useful to think about today is that with data rights, the whole sort of discourse and context around data rights, data interests, data privacy and data consent are very firmly entrenched in this idea, a Western Euro concept of the individual that really valorizes sort of individual autonomy and rights and interests. Now that's really at odds with an Indigenous worldview and way of seeing rights, which is about relational rights and collective rights and responsibilities. So I guess my question would be, where do you see the opportunity to start to pivot away from the singular way of seeing data through an individual lens to one which is much more focused on collective rights and interests? And I think that's a hard one to solve, but I'd be really interested to hear people's views on that. And I'll leave it there. I think that was more than 2 minutes.
Oh, you were great. And I'm seeing a lot of people nod their heads at your question. So I know people are going to start thinking about it again. Start using the chats if you have thoughts. We will circle back after we go through each of the panelists. That was a really great both background where you came from, To, as well as a question to think about that I know it has been surfacing in some of our past data salons, which is, can we pivot away from individualism and start thinking about collective rights, and what does that look like? So that's a really great question. I would now like to turn to, so Ray, if you could real quick introduce yourself, what you're working on, and also what we should be thinking about as well. That would be great.
Thanks, David. Yeah, magara nyathu nyampa mai Ray Lovett. So like Tahu, I'm relearning my language as well. So I just introduced myself as Ray Lovett as a Nyampa man from far west New South Wales in Australia, close to the South Australian border, for those that are familiar with the western borders drawn in Australia. So I grew up on my traditional homeland, so I'm one of the few people, particularly in the southeast of Australia, where we're still able to do that. My background in terms of work is I have a health professional background, but I also now lead an Indigenous epidemiology unit here at the Australian National University in our capital, Canberra. Like Tahu, I work on two primary areas. So the first is around Indigenous data sovereignty. I focus much more on the technical capability area, because I believe in building the capability of Indigenous data scientists and epidemiologists and sociologists. So I have a large training program here where we train Indigenous epidemiologists in particular. And with that, I do quite a bit of policy work, particularly with our federal government, around embedding principles or developing principles through our collective network that we have here in Australia, which is the Mayamnari Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective. And we work with policy agencies to apply Indigenous data sovereignty principles to the way they conduct their data activities. We've got some big reforms coming in Australia at the moment, particularly around legislation in Data Release and Sharing Act. There's an exposure draft before our Parliament at the moment for consideration. And our collective has been very involved in the consultations around that legislation to ensure Indigenous data rights they're at least aware of or embedded within that legislation. The other piece I work on is the MyQI study, which is a national level Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cohort study. It's an epidemiological study, and we use a collectivist Indigenous approach in that cohort study. So at the moment, it's the largest study of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's health and wellbeing, but it focuses on cultural reaffirmation as well, and how that improves Indigenous people's health and wellbeing. So it's the first study I'm aware of in Australia, but also potentially across the world. And I guess the question I have for the audience to think about is in our respective organisations and institutions after today, what kind of opportunities do you think you might have around Indigenous data sovereignty principles and how we might embed those in our institutions going forward? So it's not a question for right now, but after today, what will people here do?
Very well said, Ray. And I really appreciate both everything that you're doing in your background, as well as priming the pump to make sure that we are mindful through today's exercises that this is not just a conversation that's over and done with once we're done, but we actually need to think about what are we going to carry forward. So that's good priming to be mindful in this exercise. Thank you. Would now like to turn to Desi. Desi, real quick, if you could introduce yourself, also share what you're working on and what you think we should be mindful of and thinking about as well as a group.
Sure. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Desi Rodriguez Lombar. I'm a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation from Montana. I'm a social demographer based at UCLA, and I look at Indigenous erasure through different lenses, but really how official data systems have facilitated this process of Indigenous erasure in the United States, and also what are opportunities and ways that we can start challenging those existing systems, dismantling those existing systems, and reclaiming data sovereignty for Indigenous communities. So one of the current projects that I'm looking at is around Indigenous identifiers, particularly tribal identifiers in big data sets, looking at national surveys, including the United States Census, ACS, but also health surveys, labor surveys, just really kind of a big, broad collection of data sets in the US and how Indigenous identifiers are collected or not, particularly tribal. And then thinking through options to kind of for data linkage or for using computational methods to determine tribal populations in these large data sets if those tribal identifiers aren't present, which they typically aren't. So I guess a question that I want to present is what are some mechanisms that can be used to compel external entities, so this can be universities, the public, private sectors, to get on board with Indigenous data sovereignty, and to really build partnerships for data capability with Indigenous communities. I'm very keen to think through this partnership model. I run the Data Warriors Lab at UCLA. I direct this lab. It's a new lab. We're an Indigenous social science laboratory that is trying to connect Indigenous communities with scholars and policymakers, as well as practitioners and folks out in the field. So with that, I just want to say, Nia-ish, thank you for having me.
Excellent. And real quick, Desi, I think there was a question from Scott David. There was something that clipped out what he couldn't hear. He said, are we trying to avoid what was called Indigenous erasure, or is there a different term for what we're trying to make sure doesn't happen? He didn't exactly hear when it came through. So interested in your thoughts there.
Sure. Should I address that now or in
it'd be great if you, we actually, and then we'll press on to Robin. But I just thought I'd ask what was in the moment in terms of what Scott David was just asking. That'd be great.
Well, I think, this country is founded on the erasure of Indigenous peoples. So we've got over 500 years of experience in all of these systems that have been instituted to facilitate our erasure as Indigenous peoples. But we're in a very important time in terms of this movement towards Indigenous data sovereignty that is global. But in the United States, we're seeing Indigenous communities pushing back against erasure and really thinking about how systems can be dismantled and rebuilt in such a way that that visibility of our peoples and our lands and our resources is realized through data. And so, I think the reality is that Indigenous erasure exists, but there are so many different examples of how communities are pushing back against that.
That's wonderful, and it's a very meaningful term. So we really appreciate you bringing that to the conversation here. All right, and then Robin, could you introduce yourself, talk about work that you're doing. I know you mentioned you're also pursuing a PhD, so I imagine that's quite busy at the time. But what are you pursuing? And then what do you want us to be considering as we go to interactive discussion?
Sure. Ani bojo kwekwe, Robin Ro Indigenous Timiogama Nandonjba, Wabimikwa Nandodam. So my name is Robin Rowe. My family's from Temagami First Nation it's on an island. It's actually on an island called Bear Island. And I live in Ontario, Canada. I'm not sure where everybody's coming from, but it's really great to be here. And yes, I am a PhD candidate in the School of Rural and Northern Health at Laurentian University, which is in Sudbury. And I'm also a research associate, also in the School of Rural and Northern Health. And so I have the pleasure of knowing Desi, Tahu, and Ray as part of some global conversations that have been happening for the last couple of years that I kind of just got put into, and I'm now riding that, and I'm just loving every minute of being a part of this incredible advocacy work. So the Global Indigenous Data Alliance and the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group within the Research Data Alliance are two of the mechanisms that we work together in. And so here in the work that I'm doing as a PhD candidate, I'm really trying to move forward conversations in Canada around Indigenous data sovereignty, and I'm finding that it is the perfect time. This is something that I feel like society is finally kind of opening up a little bit, and they're ready for us. So I'm really excited to kind of be in there and pushing boundaries. So one of the things in my experience that I'm finding is really important to advocate for within academia as a student is institutional REBs and really trying to implement ideas of Indigenous data sovereignty within those. So I propose to everybody on the call here, in what ways do you think that we can push forward like the collective rights of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous information within institutional REBs, specifically in environments where secondary data analysis is so readily available in a lot of cases and sometimes doesn't actually require any form of ethics. So that's what I'm proposing. So
excellent. And real quick, because people may not be always familiar with REBs, maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about what they are, that might be also helpful for folks as well, if possible.
Oh, yes, sorry. So research ethic boards, we have, if you want to do research in an institution or in any space, you need to go through some sort of research ethics process. And for instance, my university, the students who need to access data, we have access to Canada-wide Indigenous-based data that it identifies Indigenous people specifically in those data, and non-Indigenous folks are getting, PhDs and masters off of the analysis of these data without ever having to step foot in a community or do what is so incredibly important, as everybody has said so far, which is making sure that those relationships and that commitment to making sure that Indigenous people are the reason you're doing this work. It's about us. If you're looking at our data, it's about us, then we need to be part of that process. And so we really need to look at how can places where research ethics boards exist when you're doing research, and whether they're through institutions like academia or other spaces, how can we make sure that we're advancing the conversation?
Excellent. And then there was another question from the chat, and I think these are in the United States, we call them internal review boards, but they're essentially the same thing. It does raise very interesting questions, which is how can we leverage what's already there? And it seems to be more in an education setting. And do private companies have ethics review boards, or do they need to have ethics review boards? And then obviously have a respect and involvement of Indigenous communities. So right now, people seem like they need a little bit of caffeine. If I could, I'd send you some caffeine or espresso. Folks seem a little quiet. Carol, I see you smiling, and I know you've thought some about these issues, so I'm going to be circling back to you probably for the next question, so just get ready. I want to hear your thoughts as you hear this, so I'm priming you, but I'm not going to put you on the spot right away. But going back to the question you said about collectivism and moving away from European perspectives, one thought that I'm thinking about is it's kind of ironic, but we've got Europe right now posturing against the United States saying we want digital sovereignty, which is, obviously they're talking more about running data services inside their own countries or inside the EU as opposed to the US. But maybe this movement where you have the EU pushing for sovereignty, might that be a chance to also say, well, wait, let's also think about indigenous sovereignty and the data that goes with that as well. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about, is that an opportunity or is it a conflict that is worth considering there?
Oh, look, I think, you know, Indigenous peoples have hundreds of years of experience with colonial settler states exercising their sovereignty claims because they have all the power. And, you know, this predated the kind of data sovereignty arguments.
Right.
And Indigenous peoples here in other countries have long said as well, hey, actually, we're sovereign peoples. This is our expression of sovereignty. This is how we want to realize it. So, I mean, in many ways, I know we haven't actually defined Indigenous data sovereignty, but it is an extension of the other self-determining sovereign rights that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities have, that have already been recognized but not activated for the most part through national sort of settler state governments. So, I mean, in a way, the Indigenous concept of data sovereignty flips on its head mainstream conceptualization. So it's not about the rights and interests and the sovereign claims of nation states. It's about the rights and interests of Indigenous nations themselves to have control over their own data. So what is their own data? What is Indigenous data? You know, I don't know if we've actually talked about that yet.
I'm interested in your thoughts. Go ahead. Yeah.
and some people in the audience might be thinking we're talking about Indigenous data, but we haven't really talked about what that actually means. So that there are sort of various definitions that are sort of being circulated around. One of the ones that resonates with me is that Indigenous data is any data that's digital or digitizable that comes from or is about Indigenous peoples, our culture, our language, our knowledges, our environments, and our resources. So that's a pretty, I mean, but it sounds really easy, but once you dive into the detail, then you do enter into some great areas about where Indigenous data begins and ends and who has authority in particular places. I think some of the useful things that have happened in this space in the last couple of years is in the establishment of Indigenous data sovereignty networks. So we have one here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, called Te Mana Raronga, which is the Māori Data Sovereignty Network. Ray is heavily involved and was a co-founder of the Data Sovereignty Network in Australia. Desi is a co-founder of the network in the US, and Robin is involved in the network in Canada as well. So we work in our own context with our own issues, but we also come together to try and advance collectively a collective vision of where we think data sovereignty needs to move and the levers that can be pulled to try and actualize some of those goals.
Fascinating. And seeing we actually have a question, and so maybe I'm going to go to Ray and then to Desi on this if you're interested. So there's a question that was asked, if the collective has rights, how do we have discussion about collective responsibilities and enforcement capabilities? Can we scale that? So it's a question about, if we're looking to collective, I mean, imagine we're probably, you know, we need to possibly step outside what we're thinking about, but I'm interested, Ray, first in your thought, Desi, and then if anyone else wants to have a rejoinder on that, just let me know.
Yeah, so we've been going through a process. I mentioned the cohort study that I manage, where we've managed to be able to have some collective ownership of the data set itself. That's interesting given that we sit within a university, but we have special provisions within our IP policy and things like that have been developed in the university around collective ownership. So that's been quite a process. But for us, it was around, so yes, you can have collective rights and enforcement, but what we've had to do in applying something really practical is we've had to have a cultural governance process. So, you know, to put it in a context that most people would understand, we have other governance mechanisms and ways of making decisions about information and data, the use of that. What we've had to do in that we can't have every single person involved in making collective decisions, but we've made participants very aware that they retain ownership of their data in this process, and that there's a cultural governance, it's all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, that sits over that data once it is aggregated and put together. So for us, it's about ensuring that we have that cultural governance in place to make decisions about Indigenous data by Indigenous people. So I hope that answers that. And then for me, so I'm the study director, and I also am bound by those cultural governance processes. Just because I'm the director of something doesn't mean I have the right to do whatever I like. So I apply those same principles and rules to myself. And I have to go before the data board to say what I want to do with the questions. We also have a process of deciding how priorities are formed out of the data as well. So that is informed by the participants in the study and through some other mechanisms that we have around determining what health research, health issues want to be examined by communities. So we bring those in, those are our priorities. The Data Governance Committee, under the data sovereignty principles, assesses whether people applying to use our data are allowed to do it that way, including me. So.
Excellent. Desi, I'd be interested in your additional thoughts too.
Sure. So I'm going to post a link actually into the chat. Is a link to so a lot of data folks are familiar with the FAIR principles, which come out of the open data movement, you know, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, of which we are all members, Tahure and Robin and myself, we've got a collective that works together to establish the CARE principles, which are collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And so I'll put a link onto this, which I know somebody had mentioned, is there some sort of framework? And so I think when we're thinking about collective benefit, the CARE principle, the first CARE principle that we have is precisely that, around collective benefit, and how that can be embedded into the way that everybody, you know, business as usual. How do we start to think about the collective rights and responsibilities? Well, this is a framework that can be used to help with that. And I'm sorry, I'm going to turn my sound off, but I'll put it in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Desi, and I love that there's the CARE principles relative to the FAIR principles. That there's something that's said with the choice of acronyms there too. So we do have a question. I'm going to go now to Julian and then to Carol. Julian, you typed 2 questions in. You get to ask one. Which one do you want to ask?
Well, one is mine, so I can't take ownership of that one. My question is, so the GeoTech, I'm part of the GeoTech Center, and what we've done over the past is we had conversations with Indian counterparts, especially in the health sector, and what we've heard is that there's a huge lack of data availability to train AI algorithms. And I'm like listening to the presentations of the initial panel, I was kind of really struck by the similarity, and I was wondering whether people in the field can explain how to manage this lack of data availability and how to train algorithms in the way that they are suitable for Indigenous communities, and not just use, such as the Indians did in the health sector, use American or any sort of foreign data and then basically just transfer it to the Indian context, and sometimes get dangerous or like harming effects in that regard. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
And just to clarify, you're talking about the Indian as the country, the nation, and what they're doing, just to clarify. So yeah, just so folks know. So I see Desi was nodding her head. Maybe Tao, you were too. If you're open to it, I'm going to go to you first to maybe have your thoughts as to Julian's question.
So I'm not a data scientist. I'm not really even a computational social scientist. I'd like to dabble in computational methods, but I won't say I'm proficient by any means. But definitely understand the need for representation, in appropriate representation in these algorithms. And I guess one of the things that this just strikes me as, an opportunity, I think the challenge, and the barrier and the obstacles are always going to be there. But if we think about opportunities, what I'm really seeing across the United States is, there is a social movement building of Indigenous young people in this country who are engaging in all sorts of activities. I guess I just see a real opportunity to think through how we can build that type of capability amongst that demographic of people who are out there. They're in our tribal colleges. There are over 30 tribal colleges in this country. And so, we have operated under, conditions of data scarcity forever, in this colonized world. This is how we operate as Indigenous social scientists, Indigenous researchers, Indigenous scholars. And so we've had to get creative because we have no choice. And so we already have that type of innovation already built into how we do business as usual, because we have no other choice but to think about linking data sets that have never been linked before, building new data in ways that have never been done before. And so I guess I just see this as an opportunity. You've highlighted a big problem. It's a problem that I think we're all very aware of. And I just think that there's an opportunity to think through solutions with our youth. So that's where I see an opportunity, and where I really see an opportunity for tech and private industry to actually start to invest in that capability building.
Excellent. Thank you.
So the situation here in New Zealand is a little different, and as I'm understanding it, your question was sort of around the lack of a data availability. That's probably less of an issue in our context for a couple of reasons. One is that the Indigenous population here comprises nearly 1/5 of the entire population. And if we looked at the youthful population, because of our different demographic structures, that will increase to 30% in the next couple of decades. So we are a very Māori Indigenous peoples in this country, are very demographically visible and probably politically visible Indigenous minority population here. The other thing is that we have a huge amount of data here. And it's not so much, the problem is not really one of data availability. And in fact, the granularity with which the state is able to know Indigenous peoples here is, particularly in the last 5 years, the sort of rapid linkage of all government held data sets into a single database here, which is called the Integrated Data Infrastructure, has been achieved here, and it's been very difficult to achieve in any other country, I think, because we only have a single layer of government and we're very technologically advanced. So data availability, integrated data, ease of access, that's not really the issue. The fundamental issue here, really, in terms of data sovereignty, is the lack of power that Indigenous peoples have to decide who gets to ask the questions of the data, who trains, who makes decisions around what data are used, how it's trained, the interpretations from that. Most of the data designers, the data analysts, the people who make the consequential decisions based on the data are not Indigenous peoples. They have no lived experience in Indigenous communities. They have very little understanding of what Indigenous priorities are. And so they're not really in a good position to be able to realize any collective benefit or to protect or mitigate against the harms that can result from I'm trying to come up with a word for it, not very careful or considered or ethical use of data. So I think the fundamental problem is one of power, actually, and lack of transparency. And New Zealand is trying to make some progress in that regard with an algorithmic charter, and that has been criticised by the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network here as just being just too soft, just too fuzzy, not providing any real mechanisms for communities who are most at risk to actually intervene and have a say and know what's going on under the hood. So there's a lot of interesting challenges here. There are some opportunities, but there's a lot to be done.
Excellent. All right, Carol, if you're open to it, I know you were nodding your head earlier. Would you like to ask a question, give some thoughts? I know you've thought a lot about the Enlightenment and how it may have missed the mark in thinking about collective versus individuals. Are you open to having something, Carol? Oh, you're muted. There.
I was just asking if my microphone was on. Well, thank you. I'm here to learn because really I know shockingly little about Indigenous issues, which has become clear to me since I retired a few years ago from 33 years in the US government. So I guess you could say I'm making up for some lost time. I'm not a data scientist, and like I said, not a specialist on this topic, but I'll just throw out a few thoughts. I think that the use of the term data, I understand why we're talking about data, because that's the focus here of the GeoTech Center, but what I see in my head is that hierarchy where data is pretty much at the bottom, and there's information and there's knowledge and wisdom. And when I think about Indigenous societies and how they might fit into where we are in this world right now with the COVID crisis really enveloping the entire world, I'm wondering how the knowledge, the cultural knowledge and the wisdom of Indigenous communities worldwide is being affected by this crisis. Because I read the stories about the last living elders of certain communities dying, and they were the last living speakers of certain languages which have now become extinct. I know many of the Central Americans that are, you know, basically captured and detained along our southern border are speakers of some of these Indigenous languages in the Mesoamerican arena that go back to the Mayan times there, and I'm concerned about that. So why I'm here is I've been wrestling with this concept of a just society, which is on David Bray's webpage for the GeoTech Center, and it's always been a politically laden topic, but the COVID crisis does show, I think, a world very sharply illuminated in terms of haves and have-nots. And there are leading figures in different sectors, including the IMF at the very top, naturalists like Jane Goodall, the expert on chimpanzee communities, and even the Pope, who are all saying very similar things about the implications for the future. So in short, I think we're at a major transition point between an old epoch in which Indigenous communities were really, you know, destroyed almost, and their data, to a new epoch in which we're going to need that knowledge and wisdom that I spoke of to even figure out how to move forward. And I think there's a moment of receptivity coming in the next year or so in these high-level sectors to integrating Indigenous knowledge in building a more just society. It might be a high aim, but it has to be part of the conversation, it seems.
Excellent. Thank you, Carol. I don't know if the panelists want to offer any rejoinders to that. Go ahead, Ray. Yes.
Yeah, I understand the concept. So, you know, I know California was recently hit, or may still be going through a major bushfire kind of incident, but most will remember at the start of this year, Australia, in particular the area where I was severely affected by major firestorms. So while that's an extreme threat in terms of what's going on in the world more broadly, one of the things that's really come from that crisis and that tragedy here is the reinstatement of Indigenous knowledge and wisdom that is held in Australia, particularly around a concept called fire stick farming, where Aboriginal people for a long time have managed to avert these, these large-scale bush storms and bushfires through this practice of what's called cool burning. Now, there are some concerns around that, in that we're now dealing with the issue around who owns that cultural knowledge, because it is cultural knowledge, and how do we protect that, because it is a collective knowledge as well. so we're just going through a process there. But now, nationally, we're talking about fire stick farming from Aboriginal people as a practice for the whole nation. And for me, that's the first time I've heard that type of conversation in Australia, where we need to be looking to how Indigenous people in this country have managed this land for at least 60,000 years. So that's through bushfire management, but also how we sustainably harvest and manage the lands as well. So while that was a horrible period, these practices, this information and knowledge and wisdom from elders really came to the fore. Even our Prime Minister's talking about these practices. So you know, horrible situation, but very large opportunity to embed Indigenous knowledges.
Wow. So we have a question, and it was asked a little bit earlier, but Duan Lee, you had an interesting question about building Indigenous capacity to endogenize data. Maybe if you could expand a little bit on that, and then we can see if the panelists have thoughts, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Duan. I work in Silicon Valley, but I also teach in local universities about data science and data privacy. So, and I happen to be married to a Native American, so this topic is intensely, intimate and close to me, right? And I have worked very closely with Google X, currently known as X, and they have a really unique program where essentially robotic engineers and programmers work with Navajo Nation. And essentially they send out mobile training teams to essentially educate young Native American kids about artificial intelligence, robotics, and things like that. Now, the reason I'm raising this point is that I think Murph actually raised this point earlier. I work in Silicon Valley, right? I look around, there are not a lot of Native American data scientists or programmers or data engineers, right? So a lot of times, think about like gaming tribes in the United States, right? So these are like really important, business establishments, but who run them is essentially outsiders, right? And this external corporate interest essentially corrupts how tribal entities run their economic development and economic self-determination. So I love this topic, Indigenous data sovereignty. It is one of the most under-socialized topics of what I call data commodification, right? But unless we talk about how we build capacity for GRC, right? Governance, risk mitigation, and compliance, I feel like we're missing a big sort of component of this very important conversation. So I'll stop there, and I want to hear from the experts how we are building Indigenous capacity to run data GRC internally, as opposed to outsourcing to people who do not understand the culture, right? The heritage, right? The suffering, the history, and all that good stuff, because they all go into the algorithms we build. I'll stop there.
Great question. Which of the panelists would like to go first? Unmute yourself and jump in. All right, maybe we'll go to Ray, then we'll go to Tahu, and then Desi. We'll just go the order that I can see on the screen. Go ahead.
This is kind of, this discussion resonates for me every day. So for me, what's really important in what I do, so I mentioned that I train a lot of epidemiologists. I know it's a bit further down the chain, but that's about reframing how we do our work in epidemiology, because epidemiology has a not so great history in terms of analysing and understanding how Indigenous people health and well-being works according to Western values. But for me, what we're pursuing in Australia, because of some legislative changes, is how do we create an Indigenous data authority, and that's at the federal level. And so that also includes how we set up and redigest Indigenous data back from our federal government and our state and territory governments, so that we're then in charge with Indigenous data sovereignty principles over that, around, and also having that training and the capability mechanisms built into that so that we're training that generation of Indigenous data scientists, epidemiologists, sociologists, and others, who are then providing guidance to those systems outside that. You know, so that's the kind of approach we're taking in Australia, and with some legislative reforms, you know, that is looking more possible now, whether the federal government realises that or not.
Excellent. Oh,
That's a wonderful initiative, and we should talk more about that, Ray. Leverage some of those learnings. But the question that you landed on around capability is absolutely essential. You know, what tribes here have done really well, I think, in the last 30, 40 years, as they've moved through a treaty-based settlement process with the government, with the national government, have done a very good job of identifying talented people within their tribes and encouraging them to go to law school. So we have, you know, cohorts, generations of fantastic Indigenous lawyers here, because the identified need was for lawyers to push through the settlements to get the resources to start doing the self-determining stuff that tribes want to do. Now I think we need to pivot. You know, the world's most valuable resource is data, and we are at high risk of another wave of colonialism, but this time it's data colonialism. So, you know, the priority, in terms of the priority settings, you know, data scientists, data designers, all the whole sort of suite of data professionals, we need those people in our tribes. I think some of the problems for me is that we can do it through kind of institutionally based initiatives to train PhD students and postgrads, you know, in our institutions, or we can start to think about different ways to train our people in place, you know. And as we start to think about a more distributed, decentralized, in situ way of exercising data sovereignty, where actually people who don't need PhDs to do this, that we can creatively design ways for people to be data stewards, data warriors, data protectors of the data that means something to them, not anything and everything, but the stuff that they care most about. You know, we're not going to get that from the government. The state sector here has failed Indigenous children miserably. So what are the creative ways that we can do this through new kinds of partnerships to realise those aspirations on the ground? And that's what I'm really interested in. And I've started moving away actually from kind of the focus on institutions to think about what can be done in place. And one of the projects that I've been, and it's a project I care about the most actually, is digitising all of the stuff in the archives about my tribe. Taking our people into the archives, we digitize it, we take it back to our customary meeting house where we share knowledge, and we're building our own tribally controlled digital infrastructure where we make the rules about who can access it, where we put our own interpretive layers over the data, and we decide how it gets used for whose benefit. And I think for me, they're the more sovereign spaces.
Very, 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 very thoughtful. Appreciate it. Desi, your turn.
Oh, I just want to echo everything that Tahu and Ray said. I'm a product of actually 2 Indigenous lawyers, and I refused to go to law school, much to their, I guess, disappointment. But now I'm employed, so they're okay with it. But yeah, same here in the United States, right? I mean, we have done a very good job of getting Native lawyers through law school, and we have this massive gap now with you know, trained data experts. But you know, I really think that the data science sphere, the tech sphere, there's just huge opportunities in this space that can work outside of mainstream, you know, academic institutions, you know, to offer short courses and hacking classes and, you know, coding opportunities, you know, much like what you said, Duan, on Navajo Nation, bringing robotics training and whatnot to young people. And so I just think that, you know, when we operate within the confines of academia and formal systems of education, and even, you know, within the federal government, we already know, you know, how that's going to pan out for us. We already know the constraints. And so I just think there's a huge opportunity to look at private sector partnership. And I want to put a plug in again for tribal colleges in this country, which are place-based, which are educating our young people in our communities. And there's just a huge gap in bringing that level of data training into tribal nations. You know, we have such a brain drain, and we need to figure out how to bring folks back in and reclaim, you know, our citizens wherever they may be, you know, because we know that the majority of our people don't live in tribal communities anymore. And I think data could be a huge way for that to happen.
Excellent. And I see, Dwan, you have a real quick rejoinder, so I'll go to you, and then I'm going to go to Merv and Desiree. But go ahead, Dwan, and do your
Okay, I'll be really quick. And, you know, I mean, I'm a very pragmatic person. And, you know, back in the day, I was a street activist. So this is like, you know, something that I'm very like, you know, accustomed to, right? Grassroots, you know, mobilization, right? And I want to challenge everyone, right, to think about essentially putting together an exchange, right, with nonprofits that provide this kind of training pro bono or at cost, right, and link tribal leaders, right, indigenous leaders, right, and their youth organization with this exchange, right. Let them self-organize distributed training and educational venues, right. If you build that ecosystem, beautiful things will pan out over time. And to me, that is the real movement that we need to build. And I'll shut up right there.
That's very powerful. And I think we may have possibly some marching orders for this group. So thank you, Dwan. And I'm now gonna, not to cut off the conversation too shortly, but I know we've got a lot of questions. Merv, you typed some questions in and some thoughts. Would you be willing to share a question that you would like to ask? And then we're gonna go to Desiree before we circle back to the panelists. So Merv?
Yeah, I'll focus on the last question that I raised. We now have more than 150 principles, AI ethics principles and frameworks, right? Don't need any more, in my opinion. But within those, I'm yet to see meaningful inclusion and representation of the wisdom of indigenous communities, as well as you know, philosophies like Ubuntu. You know, it's still very much Western focused, private funded, organization focused, male focused. So I want to understand, have you seen any challenges and obstacles in terms of representation? Like, was there any meaningful invitation for representation, or are you still, is there still obstacles around that?
Excellent. And then maybe Desiree, if you can ask your question, and then we'll circle back to the panelists on these two questions.
Okay, so for me, the more I hear about, you know, the case or Indonesia's data, the more it looks very, very similar to Africa also. So like in my country, Burkina Faso, you speak a language that is French, that is not your language, right? You communicate on a network that is owned by another country. And basically most of the traffic that is happening, be it in French and or in local language, which actually is happening a lot because most people cannot read and write in French, so they still use WhatsApp, right? But to share memos in their languages. So my question is really, how can a country like Burkina Faso negotiate data sovereignty right with a company like Orange that is 15 times bigger than the country? How can the panelists also share the solutions, because the issues are very similar? And also, as you say, it's very important to have local data analysts and also have your community look at this. I wrote a paper with NIST, and we looked at the internet connectivity in Africa, but our paper was trying to look at the real data that was happening actually in country, because most of the studies were like, if you take Morocco, Egypt, and South Africa, you have 70% of the data, right? So just look at those three countries and you're done. So really, I think there is some work that we all can do. And my question is really, you are already well versed in the problems, the issues, and deconstructing, you know, the issues for Indigenous data. are you willing to also look at, this problem in Africa? And I would really like to have your input. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so recognize that was two, but somewhat related questions about one, you've got ethical frameworks, but yet they don't seem to still get on the things we're talking about here. How do we address that? And then how do we make sure we're not all going alone with trying to address, say, Orange and other companies, but instead maybe we could work across borders, so. All right, in the absence of anyone raising their hand, I'm gonna go to you, Tahu. You gotta go first.
That's because I'm appearing first on the screen.
Exactly.
Look, you're right. There's so many different ethical frameworks, but for the most part, they haven't been taken account of, yet alone being led by Indigenous concepts of what good data looks like. I guess the problem with frameworks is they're voluntary. And that's a problem here in New Zealand as well. Unless there's some mechanism or pressure that sort of compels, persuades, influences those in power to actually take them up, they might just sit there. And the worst thing that can happen is when institutions have them as part of their sort of organizational charter, and it enables them to signal that they're doing something really important, but it's the signaling that actually becomes the action, and there's no action underneath it. So we're trying to avoid that here in New Zealand, and one way to do that is to move away from sort of ethical frameworks, to have them inform, but to actually move into sort of like the more enforceable sort of space of governance. And we've just been having a conversation about that recently. And I think from the Indigenous sort of partners in the room, the sentiment is that even governance will at some stage require some sort of legislative statutory lever, because even with governance that can be seen as quite voluntary. And so if we can have sort of the enforceable levers, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We sort of want to move away from compliance. Ultimately, we want people to get to the realization that actually, if you can have a transparent, a fair, an ethical, a regenerative, a beneficial approach to data that benefits the people who have been most marginalized, Indigenous peoples, and that recognizes our ways of seeing data, if you can do that for Indigenous peoples, that actually is going to deliver benefits for everyone. Because there's many other communities, not just Indigenous communities, who have serious misgivings about the way in which sort of data capitalism and exploitation is rolling out. So if we can kind of use and leverage and learn from Indigenous ways of doing this, then that can actually generate some benefits far beyond just Indigenous communities. And then the second thing I think was, and I think someone else should probably answer this, and this is around sort of the possible synergies with Africa. We actually did have an Indigenous data sovereignty workshop in Botswana. I can't remember if Robin or Desi or Ray was actually there, but there was actually a shared conversation and a shared dialogue about how Indigenous data sovereignty might actually sort of move forward or support the sort of aspirations that people had there. Desi, were you there? Did you want to talk to that?
I was going to say, I think we were all there, right? Ray, Robin?
They're all nodding heads, yes.
It was a phenomenal, I think, introduction for all of us to what's happening in Africa and just the similarities across, all of our respective kind of Indigenous contexts. Quite clear that there are very different ways of conceptualizing autonomy and self-determination in Africa, across nation states, but also across, Indigenous peoples, and that they're kind of at this emerging place for Indigenous data sovereignty. I don't have much to add. I just think that, it's a great reminder that we need to think, oh gosh, sorry, I missed somebody else.
So one thing I would add to this is, again, from a really practical, conceptual level that people might understand. So one of the thinkings, one of the sort of levels of work that's going on here is how do we develop Indigenous data standards for organisations and sectors. And so we've been thinking about, well, do we move towards, so in Australia, fortunately, we've just had a a review of our national Indigenous ethics guidelines. So we have a national scheme here, and the review, we've been working with them to include Indigenous data sovereignty as part of the ethical framework, and that's now included. It's not as good as we'd like, but it's there now. And in addition to that, we're thinking about, well, if organisations are moving into this space and wanting to embed Indigenous data sovereignty or Indigenous data governance principles into their work, that this Indigenous Data Authority would be the accrediting body so you, like lots of other systems, we know in data engineering and other areas that you have a set of standards that you have to abide by. So we're thinking through, well, what would that look like in terms of Indigenous data? And then people could apply to become accredited bodies around Indigenous data. So that's something that people already understand, and it's a good way of us embedding it, and it comes from Indigenous people who develop the standards.
Excellent. All right, I recognize we've gone a little bit over, but we'll do if people are willing to stay with us for as long as they can, we'll go for like the last round of questions. I don't know, Robert, if you have to head out quick, but we will do 3 more questions if you can stay with us, or if you had to have them out, it's up to you.
Please proceed. This has been amazing.
All right.
Follow away.
So we have 3 additional questions. I'm going to ask one, and then I'm going to go to Arena, and then I'm going to go to Scott David to close. We have a question from Nikhil, who asks, can the panelists possibly give a specific example where the lack of data sovereignty has harmed Indigenous people, similar to what we're seeing in COVID-19? So if you can help make us real, that would be great. And then Arena, you had a question you wanted to ask, if you could go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the tensions between everything that you guys are talking about and some of the, you know, well-intentioned efforts around open data, right? And the whole, there's been some sort of almost a push that's the ethical stance, is to open all data and gather all benefits for everybody. And I'm thinking, for example, under the Obama administration, right, which was very much about collecting data in the US and making it open to everybody. So how do you handle the tensions between these two sort of philosophies in your own work?
Excellent. So we'll circle to that. And then Scott, you get to do the closing question to bring it home for us.
I think I'm curious in the narrative, the projection of the forward narrative of sovereignty and what that would look like. All of our human history, we've been constructing sovereigns in the form of deities and royalty and nation states and commercial entities, deities, to which we can self-bind in order to organize ourselves. And so what I'm wondering is just what the aspirations are for the recognition of sovereignty. A lot of technical people of a libertarian streak talk about self-sovereign identity. That to me is a little bit solipsistic and recursive, but ultimately not inaccurate. But I'm curious just about that aspiration, because if we recognize what harms are being done currently and what rights are being aspired toward, then we can start to construct systems of duties to make those rights have animation. And so that's I'd like to hear about, not just here, but in the future, about the aspiration and the narrative, because then we can work towards that. Thanks. And thanks for a wonderful discussion.
Excellent. So it sounds like we got 3 questions for the panelists. First is, can you give a specific example of harm? Then does open data, how do you reconcile that? And does that cause unintentional harm? And then finally, if we carry this notion of collective sovereignty going forward, what does that look like? What are the ramifications? Desi, you look like you're ready to go first, so I'll let you go. And then we haven't heard from Robin, so if you're available, we'll go after the Robin, then we'll go to Ray, and we'll let Tahoe close. So.
Sure. Okay. So I can just mention the first one. Particularly, I've been doing a lot of COVID research and work on the ground, as well in tribal communities in the United States. And what we're seeing, you know, is just a huge lack of, in data availability for tribes, for tribal nations. We know that tribes are getting hit incredibly hard, you know, by COVID, and just the inability to actually identify their tribal citizens in these large data sets, and coming from hospital, hospitalizations all the way to mortality data. We can't identify tribal citizens at all. And so I think we're seeing a real we're coming to the lack of data is coming to a head, and it's really being catalyzed by what's happening with COVID-19 in tribal communities. And something's going to have to change, because I think at this point, tribal leaders, our people are dying, and we don't have the data to even be able to identify our people in death. And so I think that's a huge issue. And when it comes to, the lack of sovereignty over data, I think a really, really poignant example was the fact that with the CARES Act funding, which was, the appropriate congressionally appropriated money that was supposed to go out, to actually try to help mitigate COVID-19, tribes had to send all of their data into the federal government. All of their data, meaning their enrollment, their tax status, their income, and all of those data then were subject to a massive federal data breach. So tribes could not exercise sovereignty over their data with the federal government and say, no, we don't want to give you these data. We don't have to give you these data. The federal government said, yes, you will, or we will not give you the millions of dollars that Congress has appropriated for you to save your people. And the examples go on, but this is was such a poignant example that is just so telling of the future of data sovereignty in this country, the United States at least.
Very powerful. Thank you, Desi. Robin, I don't know if you have any additional examples, or if you'd like to also tackle the question of open data and how do you balance that as well. Up to you, Robin.
Yeah, so I'm just actually going to touch back a second to the question from Desi. I recall when we were in Botswana, we actually had a presentation by somebody, and during that presentation, she was from Africa, and she was explaining very in detail about the tribes that exist. I think there were 12 tribes, but there were 8 major tribes, and within those, there was like a very hot debate around the language, because to unify the people, you chose a language, and it ended up creating kind of these different spaces. I remember it being in particular questions around how do we define Indigenous within Africa started to come. And so just down to the root, down to those kinds of conversations when we're talking about Indigenous data sovereignty is what groups of people do we even define as Indigenous? And I think it's really important to have those conversations and to connect with people. And so work is definitely being done in Africa, and I just wanted to point that out. For me, in the work that I do, I've been really fortunate to have some really great opportunities to work with First Nations communities in Canada. So in Canada, there are 3 distinct groups of Indigenous people: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And so I get to work as a First Nations woman. I work in First Nations health research. And so some of the work that I do, in particular in the time of COVID, we're responding to the needs of First Nations people across the country, and more in particular in the province of Ontario. And so we work very closely with the Chiefs of Ontario to do that work. And some of the things that I'm finding really interesting and really highlights the need for data sovereignty is we'll hear these conversations. I hear in my spaces, I hear conversations around, oh yes, COVID is really speeding up the process of governance. It's really speeding up these sovereignty over data. But what it's really doing is COVID is speeding up the jurisdictional boundaries, and just the federal government and provincial governments are just kind of stepping over them. Instead of going through the governance process, they're just stepping over them and then saying that, oh, look at COVID is doing a great thing. And so I find that, really telling of the systems that are still so drastically broken and just, really need work ground up so that, at the end of the day, Indigenous people can actually advance autonomy in a way that is self-determining for Indigenous people. As a community-based researcher, one of the stories I really like to share is an experience I had doing community-based research. And so I was pretty sure at that time that I was following protocol. I went through the appropriate levels of government to receive the appropriate authority from the communities. I spoke with chief and council. I spoke with the health directors in the community. I went through all the different tiers that I needed to go to. I built those relationships, and I thought it was great. And I went in and I collected information. I'm a qualitative researcher. I collected qualitative stories from this community, and in order to appropriately give that information back, I attended a series of events that they have, annual events, and I was there and I was sharing the information and I was doing all that. And I had somebody come up to me on the last day and say, who let you come in here? Where did you get permission to come into my community? And I was like, what? Oh no, I went through the health directors, I went through chief and council, I got consent from here and there and all over the place, and every person who contributed, and that's why I'm here, is to give that information back. And they looked at me and they said, yes, but did you talk to the Kokums, which is grandmothers? Did you talk to the grandmothers? And I said, what? The grandmothers. So for me, in that very moment, I hadn't realized that there was even a grandmothers to talk to. And so you end up going through all these processes, and it's sometimes a really challenging thing to find the appropriate doorway into a community. But for me, as a First Nations woman, having not spoken to the Kokums, I suddenly realized that my information, the data I collected, the data I was giving back, was actually worthless. It was worthless to that community. And so at the end of the day, that information just ended up, you know, it wasn't productive for the communities. And so for me, it was a learning opportunity, and now I get to share it with other people. And, you know, I just think it's really important to really make sure you understand how important it is to go about research in a good way with the communities.
Very powerful, and thank you, Robin, for that. That's a very poignant example, and we appreciate you sharing it. All right, Ray, if you and then Tahu, maybe we can shift a little bit more to the open data question, and then maybe the more optimistic, what does the future look like question, so we can end on an optimistic note. That would be great.
Well, I can cover both in the open data. So this conversation around open data for me is not funny. Because if we start talking about open data for Indigenous people, we start to see that there are problems with that concept. Because for me in Australia, while the idea of open data is here, it's not real for starters. So there's still processes people have to go to. It's not a free-for-all, or it shouldn't be. So I think just because of the term, and so it is not open data for Indigenous people. That's the opportunity, that's the wishes of our tribes and different groups, is to have access to our own data. And in Australia, it has a particular problem because indigeneity or Indigenous status has a special provision under privacy, which no other group has. So our data is not open to us. It is open certainly to others. That's a problem. So if we're talking about equity of openness for use of data, that would be great. So there are definite opportunities there. It also goes to the narrative kind of sovereignty that Scott mentioned before. So it would be wonderful for us to it'd be great if we didn't have to mention Indigenous data sovereignty, that word, because for most of the rest of the population, sovereignty is innate. They don't have to mention it. But for us, for me, the language I use around that is to strengthen and rebuild the nation that I belong to, which is everyone's right in the various nations that they live in. For Indigenous people, it's different. We have to reclaim our sovereignty for our nations. Australia is unique. It did not sign any agreements with the colonial settlers. So our sovereignty still exists. It was never ceded. We never had agreements in place. So for us in Australia, we always say sovereignty never ceded, but we are reclaiming it. And data rights is one of those ways. It's no different to the rights of any other person in Australia as a nation, but we need to make people aware that their sovereignty is innate, ours is not. And it's just for me, that's what that expression means. And that goes to, rebuilding our nation, our state, our tribe, the same rights as other people have.
Very powerful. Thank you for that, Ray. And wow, I look forward to a day in which your vision can come true for everyone around the world. That's very powerful. All right, so thank you again. Tao, you get to bring it home for us. We really appreciate you being the origin of this panel. Your closing thoughts on this or anything else as we wrap it up?
I thought that was a great note to wrap it up on, Ray. Oh, look, I've really enjoyed the questions. You know, for people who are engaged in this, what we would call a kaupapa, or this topic, if you want to reach out to us and support our efforts and what we're trying to achieve, please, by all means, reach out. I think just to end by circling back to the question that I think Scott answered, which was a really deep and hard one, actually. And I guess my way of answering that would be that our view on well-being, whether it's data or whether it's anything else, whether it's the well-being of our environment, of Mother Earth, of our lakes, of our rivers, of our waters, it's always intergenerational. And when we're thinking about our grandchildren yet to be born, we're thinking about our grandchildren's grandchildren. And my ancestors before me, as we're going through all these historical records and digitizing them, that's what they were thinking about. You know, when I'm reading the work of my great-grandfather, he was thinking about his great-granddaughter yet to be born. There's inherently an intergenerational perspective that we bring to everything that we do. And partly that's because our identities are rooted in the collective and they're situated. And so you can't revert just to the individual, what's good for me. I mean, you can try, but someone's going to remind you. Probably a stroppy auntie. The relationality of well-being and obligations and responsibilities is deeply embedded in who we are. And from that, I take a lot of optimism for the future.
Excellent. Very beautiful. Really appreciated the robust discussion. Thank you, Tahu. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Desi. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Robert and Accenture, for sponsoring this and the entire discussion today and the audience. We've had a lot of fun. We will do a recap of this. We will also try to do, again, we're non-attribution, but we'll try to do some recap from the chat as well as a blog post. We'll try to share additional links. And like we said, this is a journey. We look forward to continuing it together. Thank you all.
Thank you.